Our next session will be Flourishing-centered Growth and Development Model. Please welcome to the stage your moderator, Declan Curry.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our discussion, Flourishing-centered Growth and Development Models. I'm Declan Curry, journalist and broadcaster. I'm delighted to be your moderator today, and I want to thank you all for being with us for this economic conclave, as you will, only we will be released from here within 45 minutes rather than 8 or 9 days, as it might take in Vatican City this week. Our speakers here are Sachin Chaturvedi, John MacArthur, Richard Salmons, and Elizabeth Sideropoulos. Please make them welcome with a round of applause. So let me give you some very brief introductions as we all settle in. Sachin Chaturvedi is Director General of the Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries. That's a public policy research institute based in New Delhi in India. The professor is a distinguished scholar in development economics, specializing in trade, investment, innovation, and South-South cooperation. Opposite him is John MacArthur, who's director of the Centre for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. That's a prominent think tank in Washington, D.C. in the United States. His work focuses on deprivation and global cooperation and the practical implementation of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The other side of the table from him is Richard Salmons, who's a senior fellow at the Centre for Trade and Economic Integration at the Geneva Graduate Institute, a research powerhouse in global trade and conflict resolution. It is a nursery for heads of states, UN officials, and senior diplomats. Richard was Director of Research for the International Labour Organization, preparing it for meetings of the G7 and the G20, and was an advisor, once upon a time, to Bill Clinton when he was US President. The good old days, Rick, I think I refer to that as. And then Elizabeth Sideropoulos, who's the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, an independent think tank in Johannesburg, South Africa, promoting a well-governed, peaceful and economically sustainable Africa. She's been in that role for 20 years. She's also one of the co-chairs of the South Africa T20. She is a widely acclaimed and influential voice on African political and socio-economic development. So we are delighted to have all four of them with us here for our discussion. The argument has been made at Global Solutions for many years that the globalized free market economy is broken. The gap between rich and poor is too great and in some places widening. The planet is burning. Too many people fear that they have no control over their lives or their futures. That inequality and discontent has fueled populism, nationalism, and an inward-looking fear of our global neighbours. Dennis Snower has argued, and did once again here on this stage this morning, that we need a new social contract. This discussion is about how that new social contract is to be designed and then implemented, and how solutions can be achieved in a world that is increasingly fractured. Elizabeth, let's start with you. A new social contract that aligns more closely the economic, social and environmental needs of its citizens with the purpose of business and with national government objectives. What's got to be in it to make it work?
Let's sort of take a step back and say we really have to redefine our paradigms, and we really have to rethink and reconnect with our value systems. You talk about the points that Dennis also made this morning and has made over countless global solutions summits, which is the fact that there is a disconnect, a serious disconnect. We've become the handmaidens, society, citizens have become the handmaidens of a financial system. So we look at development through the prism of whether it makes sense for the financial system. Let me give you an example. One of the priorities of the South African G20 is really about rethinking how the debt structure and debt frameworks should be changed, should be reformed, because they actually don't work. The way in which they operate, and debt is not a bad thing, right? Debt's a good thing if you're allocating it to developmental objectives and so on. But if we're looking at it through the prism of AAA credit ratings, whatever that might mean in a social context, or we're looking at it in terms of being able to pay back in 10 or 20 years when we know developmental priorities take much longer. That actually condemns not only developing countries, but also the have-nots across the world to a world, to a future that is not about improved well-being, improved livelihoods. And so it's really redefining those values and what defines success. Because I think success for so long has been about the money world. It's about how much more you can consume, how much more you can grow. And I think we've lost some of the very, very basic values that actually make us happy.
But just on that specific issue of debt and debt in Africa, what then might the solution be? Is it limiting debt so that borrowing is only used for infrastructure, for development purposes? Is it limiting the interest that is charged on that debt? Is it opening up new pathways to increase access to capital?
Well, there's a whole bunch of proposals on the table in terms of how you deal with it. And it's not certainly debt if you're borrowing to finance your current expenditure. That's never a good idea. So that's one thing. But it's some of the systems that have to change. So the way in which, and this is not the most fundamental problem, but the way in which credit rating agencies factor in what they call an African risk premium. The methodologies they use, the extent to which they're actually familiar with the contextual environment in which these countries operate. The fact that they believe that they actually are going to renege on their debt, where in fact most of the time they don't renege on their debt, they renege on their socioeconomic delivery, right? We heard this morning from Allah, delivery is legitimacy. And so that erodes the legitimacy of the state. Another one has to do with the way in which we might think about climate and debt for climate swaps. Another one may very well be about the extent to which you really put really concessional loans at the center of borrowing, and how the private sector and private creditors actually engage in this. And then it's really creating a global framework for debt sustainability, which debt at the moment, debt issues, debt restructuring doesn't really have a home. You know, it sits in the IMF, it sits in various places. And perhaps lastly, also looking at some of the prudential regulations around these issues and Basel III and the way in which the Financial Stability Board works.
We will move on, but just to make this point, if you were worried about the IMF and the World Bank and Wall Street, are you also worried about the levels of indebtedness on African nations to China?
That is one of the dimensions of debt distress that countries in Africa are facing, but it's not the only one. And I think it's the structure that really needs to be focused on rather than individual countries.
Fine. Sachin Chaturvedi from India, from the RAS think tank. What do we need to do differently from what we're doing today?
I think there are three dimensions that we need to focus on. Number one is in terms of the new development paradigm that we have been discussing in Global Solutions platform for the last 2 years. And this discussion now is definitely the time has come to finalize the contours of it. And that probably would bring in the dimension and the roadmap that is necessary. Today morning we heard Dennis laying out the guardrails. But I think what is more important is to see how developed countries who are also looking for the new avenues for economic growth, emerging markets who have arrived at some point, but also the least developed countries who are also looking for market and for survival. So all these three would have to be considered in this new development model. The second point is where the resources would come in from, what kind of approach we should have. And third is the philosophical framework that is needed. And in my view, there are 5 components to that which are important. First and foremost is this excessive financialization that we ended up with, the idea of consumption-led growth that we ended up with. We need to nuance it by bringing in sustainable consumption, sustainable production. Now, how do we define that? It would take me long to explain, but definitely there are parameters of defining the sustainable consumption and production. The second important component of that is to build the resilient infrastructure. Today morning we heard about it. There are ways that this is being done by different countries and different strategies may come in, but resilient infrastructure certainly is an important dimension. Third is how we are going to measure this change, how to capture that data. And that's where a huge debate exists in terms of how do we go beyond GDP. The idea of well-being measurement, and there are multiple frameworks which are available. UN is pushing for it. The idea of those who have faith and belief in SDGs, they are taking it forward. But also countries that are realizing the value of biodiversity and oneness with nature, they all bring that in. The fourth, which I think is extremely important, is to realize the strength of the social enterprises. How do we bring in social enterprises? How do we support them? And that's one which in the US, but in many other parts of the world, they are getting traction and going beyond. The last point that I want to mention is in terms of bringing ethics back on the table. How do we bring in ethics? And this is not something new I'm saying. It is being realized right from the days when Lehman Brothers collapsed. But every time we have overcome that. Today we see a huge criticism of the current administration in the US. But somehow in the past we have been overlooking problems which have led to what the crisis we are facing. So I think ethics should come back on the table, both in finance, but also in the way we give access to this. And that's where I feel access, equity, and inclusion are important components of that.
There is a mix there of action that is taken at local level, action that is taken at national government level, and then global action. Is the world in a place now where any sort of global cooperation like that is feasible?
Definitely. I think this idea that Dennis was referring to this morning in terms of my nation first thinking is something that has its downside when you enter it at the national level. In the global level, you are thinking of your nation as first. But when it comes down to the boundaries within your nation, then somehow you end up by saying you first and others behind.
Well, Dennis talked about grand bargains, so deals that were done only if you can convince both sides that it's in their benefit.
Exactly, and that's where the idea of access, equity, and inclusion is true for everybody. It is at the global level, it is at the national level, and it is also at the local level, so that you have AEI, access, equity, and inclusion, at all the three levels.
Okay, thank you. John MacArthur from the Brookings Institution. Let me bring you in on this. On the features that a flourishing growth and development model might have, what's on the list?
Well, thank you. And I would take the liberty that Dennis gave me to go a little bit academic for a moment, because I'm going to start with a very simple statement, but then maybe go back to concepts. So the simplicity, which I think his remarks spoke to this morning, is I would argue that our institutions are generally seen as failing. It's a broad statement, but I think one that is widely held. And there's two reasons why they're failing. Institutions at their core are intended to hold people together. Very, very often in many countries and across many countries, they're seen as either keeping people out or not delivering on anything related to what they're supposed to do.
When you say institutions, do you mean political? Do you mean the United Nations? Do you mean economic bodies? How wide is your net?
This is exactly it. I think generally people have in mind public institutions, and that is a very big bucket unto itself, but institutions of public domain, call it. I think the big challenge we're having now then is the concepts is, well, there are a few big things going on underneath this. One is, well, what are the institutions for? In our societies, we have many competing interests around what's most important. And it's not just self-interest, it's actual perspectives on what's most important. I go to rooms around the world, and I have ever since these Sustainable Development Goals were set. And I say, okay, each of you, what do you think is the most important issue in the world? It doesn't take a very big room to get 17. And then I say, well, which one of you is right and which one of you is wrong? Oh, well, that's the wrong question, but that's what we're used to saying. And then I go to a government and they'll say, well, we have to pick priorities. And I'll say, well, how many members are there in your cabinet? Often there's dozens. Can each of them do half a thing? The reality is each of them has a long list of things that they're trying to do, but they have no way to pull it together. We don't have a way to really bring together these concepts of diverse interests, but also diverse views around what's most important. And that gets into a challenge because, Ken Arrow, the famous economist in 1950, talked about the impossibility theorem of ranking preferences across a society when everyone has a different view of ordering of preferences. We're still stuck in that, but with the Sustainable Development Goals, I would argue there are conceptual success and people recognizing, gosh, there's this whole big set of things we need to be tracking that everyone thinks is important, but we're only wired for a few things. And this gets into the who. So who's in these institutions? A lot of them are still purely public sector. In my view, the biggest technical innovation of the global institutions in the past 25 years is the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. Why? It's got public sector of North and South. It's got civil society of North and South. It's got business sector, philanthropy sector, and importantly, it's got technical review at its heart, independent technical review of, is this working? And for that reason, it's the only major international institution to have a self-driven reform 10 years after it was started. And so we have not applied those basic principles into our how.
So what will work is something that is property focused, has maximum buy-in, has a monitoring system within it to check that it's working, and a method of correcting that.
Yes, and we need it at multiple levels. And different problems need different types of institutions. Some problems need much more private sector engagement. Some problems need much more purely public sector engagement, and some problems need scientists at the core. And we need to mix our purpose with our structure. And within that, we need to have, and this is where AI could be a boost, and it could be a problem. We need ways to bring people together and gather those insights and distill them, play them back, but then feed them in at the level of governance at which those interests can be served. At the core, it becomes purpose-driven institutions. And that's where I see the role of technology to bring people back together so that they can both see the interest but also see the results.
So our flourishing growth and development model, the key people are who? Who should be in it?
So it depends on the problem. That's my point. Don't ask me for a single answer to a complexity of the world. Because if we're talking about infectious disease, I'm going to have a different answer than I will about job creation, than I will about education, than I will about tackling climate. So each of these needs its own consortium and alliance of actors with a structure of accountability so that people can see results. So much of it in democracies, so much of it comes down to who gets elected, which is a whole source of legitimacy unto itself. But often people are complaining, even when they're voting, well, who's going to really be involved if I make this vote? And that's where we need to have much more clarity on who's going to be involved. And again, back to the first statement, these institutions, they're not just keeping people out. Many of the most talented people in the world look at them and say, they're not bringing expertise in. And we need to do both.
So Richard, what we're talking about here is a resilience, a robustness in policy making, which I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my interpretation was that John is saying that sometimes that is absent from the process, that robustness, that resilience.
Yeah, I do think that the problem runs deeper than individual areas of policies and individual trade-offs, which are appropriate to be muddling through, thinking through. But the organizers of this conference have framed this session as on the growth and development model, and it's framed this notion of human flourishing. And I think that's a good starting point for the discussion here, and indeed for the entire conference. When you say growth and development model, it's really talking about the theory of how an economy develops. You're into the realm of economists, academic economists, and practitioners. And when you say human flourishing, to me that's an explicit counterpoint to what economists traditionally focus on, which is productive output. The science, quote unquote, of economics for the last 100 years or so has been about refining our understanding of how you improve productive output, measured typically by GDP, mainly through measures that improve allocative efficiency and accumulate capital and the like. That's a very different thing from what I think the organizers of this conference mean by human flourishing, which really goes to how well your household and your community is doing in terms of a multidimensional aspect of welfare. So, your material welfare, which is what economists are mainly focused on, but indeed, as President Snower mentioned at the beginning, some very important non-material aspects of welfare, like a sense of solidarity, cohesion in the society. Now, the challenge, I think, why this problem runs deeper, is that economics, which is extremely influential in making decisions within governments, doesn't treat explicitly, let alone systematically, the critical role of a wide range of legal norms, policy incentives, and institutional capacity, mainly in the public sector, that have a bearing on different aspects of your household's standard of living. It's, I've done some work recently in a book where I lay out that the very wide difference in outcomes on household living standards among countries at basically the same level of GDP per capita, which just illustrates the point. The missing link is taking a systematic treatment of these institutions, legal norms, policy incentives, in key areas that matter: employment, opportunity, disposable income, the availability and affordability of material necessities, economic and social security, and environmental security. Productive output doesn't have a lot to say about that. Economics essentially considers outcomes in those areas and the institutions that enable that broad diffusion as an afterthought, as a residual consideration. It's essentially a trickle-down process of the politics that follows the economic. That's the way the economic community thinks.
Sure, but if I may say, Elizabeth, groups like this have been making that argument for a long time, and the needle is not moving. What is going to move the needle?
Well, I think it's important to make these points and to be prepared for when the needle is ready to move. In other words, I think we're at a tipping point at the moment where a lot of the challenges and the problems that we have been talking about are manifesting themselves in a way that, dare I say, is going to be extremely counterproductive, not just to the planet as a whole, but even to humans. We're saying we have to look at this systemically, but I think if we were to disaggregate it, it's going to affect everybody. And so a lot of these ideas that have been on the table, the big discussion also about going beyond GDP as a metrics, are they ready to move in? So I don't think we need to look at this in a negative way and saying, well, we've been talking about this for a long time. Because what sometimes happens is that, I think was it Lenin who said sometimes it takes centuries for something to happen.
Nothing happens for years, and everything happens in weeks.
But these are there. And I think these conversations in forums such as these are so critical to be able, because ideas are generated by discussion, by debate.
But we're going backwards. The election of Trump on a platform of you feel left out, so vote for things that will make you worse off, but it'll make someone else even in an even worse state than you. That's what's winning votes.
Yes. And this is where I think it might be the tipping point. Sometimes you've got to move backwards in order to move forward. So, but sometimes you've got to blood rules and institutions, etc., to actually make progress. But I think Rick wanted...
John MacArthur was nodding in disagreement there. As a representative of the 51st state of America, the state of Canada, what is your thought?
I'm going to ignore that statement. I'll just say that I think that it's really important to understand how disappointed people are in institutions on a generational basis. And I don't, and as a friend of mine who's in public life in another jurisdiction said that when people look at the so-called left and look at the right and say it doesn't make any difference, that's where they break the glass. I think we have to understand that one might disagree with a variety of propositions that are being put forward, but the amount of public discontent of please do something on this. If one looks at the issues, and I would just say, I think Rick and I are in violent agreement on the concepts that are underneath this. I call it the recoupling, decoupling, we-coupling challenge. That's the concepts. It all boils down to recoupling economic prosperity with people's sense of well-being. Those are disconnected. Decoupling, as Dennis and others have emphasized, the economic progress that's essential from the environmental problems. But the we-coupling it's twofold. It's we're all in this together, but we all have the same access to opportunity. I don't think most countries feel like we're all in this together right now, and they don't feel like we all have the same access to opportunity, whether legitimate or not. And so solutions will get put forward, but they've got to be good solutions, and inevitably you have to make sure you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's the classic challenge. But we do have to see the need for massive, I would say, wholesale renovation, or not just rebuild, but new build of our structures of public problem solving. And so we're about to go through probably unprecedented technological change, both in AI and digital and biomedical. We have no idea how different the world's going to look 20 years from now. The scary part of that is, oh my goodness. The proactive part of that is how do we build these systems that bring in the right forms of expertise? You don't want someone using 20-year-old technology to govern a frontier of 2045, even in their technology of thinking. So I do think we need to have a new build mindset wherever is possible, at the international level, at the domestic level, at the local level. And we can really think about, this, I mentioned Ken Arrow and this impossibility theorem because even the we coupling is my little simplification of all these big problems. They don't have a way to rank order because different people will have different sense of what's most important. We need to find ways to galvanize communities around that. And I agree, the economists are often the very last ones to catch up on this, I say as an economist. But I don't think it's for naught. It's actually a generational evolution too. And we're starting to see more and more ingredients of people starting to say, gosh, we need new institutional technologies that find a way to actually solve problems on an iterative basis, not just a one-off.
Okay, you've mentioned artificial intelligence a few times there. I want to pick that as an issue just to test how the features of this growth and development model might reflect the world that we actually live in. Now, leaning on your experience as a leading policymaker for the International Labour Organization, how do we create a model in a world that is going to be increasingly driven by artificial intelligence that still gives people a sense that they are in control of their own lives? Richard.
Yeah, if you think that we collectively have done a poor job of managing the dislocation and income dispersion in the last 20 years as a result of the first phase of digital transformation and global economic integration, realize that we're facing at least that much disruption coming in the next 20 years from AI, but also from net zero related types of green transition. So what I mentioned earlier, this notion of recoupling or re-embedding economics in societal bottom line requirements, which is flourishing, which is what I call broad-based progress in household living standards, is going to become even more critical going forward. And so I want to come back to this growth and development model. You've got to change the source code, what I call the source code of capitalism. Economists and the mental model of the growth and development is so influential in the way governments operate. And if it doesn't include this whole apparatus of legal norms and policy incentives and public institutional capacity, that is the underlying or implicit income distribution system, or what I prefer to call the living standards diffusion mechanism, underlying market-based economies, we're again going to miss the boat. When we talk about a social contract, there is a complete disconnect between the notion of a social contract, I must say, and the practical world of economics, both theory and policy. And what it means, the missing link, is that taking seriously and explicitly that wide panoply of the institutional enabling aspect of economies and mainstreaming that, hardwiring that into the growth and development model. That's how we arrive at a human flourishing, or what I call a human-centered approach to economics, and much better outcomes. Final thought in this regard. Yes, there are many reasons why our societies are polarizing politically right now. Some of it has to do with identity, immigration, no doubt about it. But I would argue that at least as important has been this disconnect between the way we think about running our economies, which is to try to produce more stuff more efficiently, which I call the top line of economic performance at a national level, and the bottom line, which is basically explicitly understanding that you need to translate that through these various types of policies, norms, and capacities into what matters for people in their lived experience in households. I think, to end on the AI point, if we've already learned a hard lesson the last 20 years. We need basically to go back to the basics, to first principles of economics, and rewire it in this fashion. That's what my recent work has done. And lastly, I think we need to engender, kind of what this conference is doing, much wider engagement and ferment intellectually, policy-wise, among those who are working fundamentally to reform the growth and development model. They tend not to be the most famous and the oldest people in the profession, by the way. And so I'm happy that the United Nations Economist Network, about 500 economists across the UN system, is playing a role in trying to facilitate, stimulate a wider degree of connectivity among those networks around the world, mainly academic networks, but not only, in an initiative that is forming right now.
Okay, how do we take that thinking and then use it to change everyday lives in nations around the world?
I think if you hear what John had to say in terms of evolving purpose-based institutions and trying to solve the larger challenges that we have, I picked the point that Richard made in terms of the growth and development models, trying to bring in the philosophical frameworks, because purpose-specific vehicles, if they are bereft of philosophical moorings, then we end up with the crisis that we are going to end up with. And this, I think, requires us to see how, as economists or as academics, and that's what Global Solutions is trying to do, we bring in sound theory and we bring in evidence that are going to place there. And if you see the work that Japanese economist Yanihara has done, trying to bring forward the idea of the distinction between endowment-based approach and the ingredient-based approach. The endowment-based approach talks in terms of how you need to see the macroeconomic variables, what framework, what parameters that are required. But the ingredient-based approach is in terms of how we create capacity in the system. How do we bring in and how we achieve growth even when macroeconomic variables are in disequilibrium. And that is what the least developed countries and many others would require. The collapse of Washington Consensus and the collapse of the framework that led the global system to the kind of inequalities and exclusions that we have ended up, despite of us talking of inclusion for last 15 years or so, we see a huge resource crisis. So I think it is extremely important for us to have broad frameworks, to bring in philosophical frameworks, to have faith in global regulatory system. We can't let AI go without governance model. We can't say that let private sector work with the AI the way they want to evolve. We can't allow everyone to land up in space. We need to have international coordination and the balance that is needed in oceans, in space, in water, and in other resources. So it is important for us to bring that governance model here.
Some issues are just so great, they require a global solution. There's
Absolutely
no other way of doing it.
Exactly.
But for everything else, is it possible that the fracturing of globalization creates extra space that wasn't there before for local solutions, for grassroots solutions, to provide an alternative approach?
Because that's where, Mr. Curry, it would be important for us to realize that the whole idea of ingredient approach gives you that space for decision making, for communities to find their solutions and be with it. The idea that French evolved at some point of growth poles and development corridors, they are the ones who are going to give communities their solutions. One way import-led industrialization is not the solution. And that's where you need to create livelihood security at the local level. You need to create that plurality in the economy.
Elizabeth, we've had the G20 in the south of the planet now for some years. Is that giving us a refreshed viewpoint on this? Brazil talked a lot about the importance of those local self-help approaches to development.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the G20 may go through some choppy times over the next period, but I think it's incumbent.
Brackets become largely irrelevant. Question mark.
Question mark. I think the agenda has also expanded exponentially, which presents its own challenges. But I think what Brazil tried to do, and which South Africa is going to follow, is really to bring citizens into the discussions. The extent to, and I think that builds up. You can't see the results overnight. But I think what's very important, just to reiterate what the point that Sachin made, it's how also you empower and enable communities to think that they actually can do things, that they don't have to rely on experts, because I think there's been a bit of that has infused development, that you've been living in this village for thousands of years, but actually let me tell you how to do things, and I've lived in the city. And it's really empowering local communities and being able to create opportunities for sharing experiences, for learning from them, and also to some extent to scaling up. Now, whether the G20 through the social summit, which South Africa is going to repeat this year, is in a position to do that and really to scale up, I think we'll have to see. But it is very important. It is about, we're talking about SDGs also. The debate that South Africa wanted to bring to the table, which has been muted a little bit, has been really how do we localize it, and how do we, and it is at the grassroots level where change is going to matter. But relatedly, I think another interesting point that South Africa is putting onto the agenda of the G20, which is highly contentious in some quarters, but that's what the G20 can do. I think, you've got to push the envelope. I think it was really interesting to hear what Allah said about consensus. Sometimes you just got to lead. It's the issue of, let's think about the global public goods, the point that Dennis made this morning, that it's actually important to have the conversation about exactly how we govern, how we resource global public goods and how we define them. Because that's also part of this global discussion. At the local level, there are initiatives that have to happen at that level, but there are also initiatives that impact on the local that really are about collective action at the top. And the discussion around global public goods, contentious as it might be, in the G20 forum of member states and other guests, creates that opportunity. And I think the G20 can be that kind of sort of pioneer in some of these debates, because we know how difficult sometimes it is to really bring them into the more formal multilateral forums.
So you think the G20, even with US disengagement from the rest of the world, the G20 is still relevant?
Yeah, well, the US hasn't disengaged from the G20, not entirely.
Well, today's Monday, let's check on
Yeah, let's check. Yes. But it's what we make of it, and whether we can make it relevant. I was at a conference 3 days ago with a number of Africans who haven't really always necessarily engaged on G20 issues from around the continent, because they've only recently joined us. And the point that we need to constantly make is that a forum such as that actually does impact on the ground. If you're talking about trying to develop some initiatives and a call to action, for example, around social protection and the work that the ILO has done, and you're managing to build consensus among most in the group, sufficient consensus in the group around social protection, and these countries then begin to sort of work together to deliver that, that has a real impact on people on the ground. But we're not also making those connections where sometimes things do work. And we must make the case. Otherwise, it simply goes back into that the tropes of these big meetings that are completely disconnected from reality.
Rick, is it possible that Trump is right? That he has one of the solutions that we've been looking for at events like this all these years? And the solution is to have more protection for workers within your nation, even at the expense of global cooperation.
I would say that the premise of the current administration's actions is right in the following sense. The world economy is exhibiting a state of disequilibrium. There are large, very large, and very persistent global economic imbalances. That part, I think, is right, and I think it's fair to say the G20 over the years has ducked that challenge. That's the part that I would say yes. But I think that the way forward for both international economic cooperation in the G20 and elsewhere, and countries within their own growth and development model, is to do a version of what Dennis was saying earlier, is to find the 2-for-1 win. And that is, he framed it as, where global cooperation can explicitly yield national progress. I would say in economics, there's exactly the same concept that's sort of left on the table, unclaimed, which is that there are 2-for-1 outcomes, wins, that can follow from a sharper look at social contract-related institutional improvements in your economy that can be both good for inclusion, sustainability, resilience on the one hand, what I call the social quality of growth, and the quantity of growth, GDP on the other hand. This country is about to go through exactly that type of an experiment, through its recognition that it needs to boost, and it's found a fiscal way finally to strengthen investment in infrastructure. The Japanese economy found this about 10 years ago when it determined that it needed to change its labor laws so that you limited the discrimination against women's participation. I could go on with multiple examples. Strengthening for developing countries a basic universal floor of social protection improves aggregate demand, et cetera. There are 2-for-1 wins in economics that have gone unclaimed at the national level, and then I would say finally to end up on your emphasis on the G20, where I see you driving, maybe because we have the privilege of having Elizabeth here with us today, and that is if you accept the premise that we do have large and persistent global economic imbalances that require a multi-portfolio attack, particularly macroeconomic cooperation, the constructive way to get a positive sum game outcome from the current trade conflict is to recognize that we need a macroeconomic exercise in cooperation like we had in the 80s in the Louvre and Plaza Accords, in which the US agrees to reduce its fiscal deficit over a series of years. The Chinese government agrees to finally do what it has been talking about for many years, which is to increase the level of consumption as a share of the economy and drive growth that way rather than through throwing money at industrial investment and export surpluses. And frankly, the Europeans, because particularly here in Germany has just moved to relax its debt brake, it's the most likely catalyst or broker of such a win-win, positive sum game, macroeconomic cooperation foundation for a resolution of these global economic imbalances and then an easing of the trade conflict.
Okay, an optimistic note, and I'm glad that we have found it towards the end of our discussion. About 30 seconds from each of you. Is the best that we can hope for simply to find the best that we can possibly do in an imperfect world and be happy with that?
I think I would just extend further what Elizabeth and John said in terms of identifying institutional mechanisms. Like, for instance, small at the sectoral level, we can do something like the Ecology Impact Fund. You just create and you identify the way externalities would be addressed in a situation where adequate compensation would be given, and you find sectoral solutions.
Okay, thank you. Do we have to limit our ambition?
No, but we have to identify the steps that one can take in a particular global climate.
Thank you. John, I'll take a last thought from you if you want to offer it.
I'm going to say one concept, one practical.
Sure.
Concept, I think the great hope right now, actually in an academically friendly conference, is the journals. Science, nature in particular, the family has really taken on these long-term issues and made an editorial commitment to host the debates on what will work. This doesn't work over the long term without that, and I want American Economic Review to keep doing more of the same. At a practical level, I work a lot on extreme poverty. I think we should be ambitious. We have this whole overhaul of the global development system right now. We also have new technologies like digital cash transfers that weren't available before. There's an idea, maybe we should think about cash as default. Turns out maybe we could end extreme poverty within 5 to 10 years simply through the latest evidence on what works. So I think we can actually be much more practical and much more ambitious and take the signal that new ideas are needed.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers with a round of applause. Thank you. And we will now have a short pause in our deliberations. Our sessions will resume in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.